There is a street in Washington, D.C. that is 160 feet wide. It runs from the eastern steps of the United States Capitol to the north facade of the White House. A straight line, slightly declining in grade from east to west, approximately 1 mile and 200 feet in total length. The street is called Pennsylvania Avenue. It was designed in 1791. The year it was designed, the city it was built to serve had a total recorded population of 3,210 people. That figure comes directly from the first federal census, conducted 1 year earlier in 1790, counting every man, woman, child, and enslaved person living within the boundaries of the new District of Columbia. 3,210. The entire population of the proposed capital of the United States could have stood, a shoulder to shoulder in a dense crowd, in a space roughly the size of 4 standard city blocks. Pierre Charles L'Enfant designed a street for them that is, at its roadbed alone, wider than a standard Manhattan city block is deep from building face to building face. He did not design one street like that. He designed 14. Historians will tell you that L'Enfant was a visionary with a long horizon. The accepted explanation, which appears in Lewis Mumford's 1961 The City in History, in Kenneth Bowling's 1991 The Creation of Washington, D.C., and in every architectural survey of the federal city produced across the last century, is that L'Enfant was not designing for the city that existed in 1791, but for the capital he believed the Republic would eventually require. He had spent his formative years near Versailles, and he had grown up in the shadow of a city whose proportions announced the power of the institution it served. He arrived in America with the conviction that the new republic deserved a capital whose dimensions would communicate permanence, ambition, and democratic grandeur to every foreign minister, every visiting dignitary, and every future generation who would one day walk these streets. L'Enfant himself made this argument in his own hand. He wrote explicitly to President Washington that the city must be built on a grand and permanent scale, specifically anticipating a future population that would grow into its avenues over the coming century. This explanation is plausible. It is internally consistent. It is supported by L'Enfant's own surviving correspondence. It has carried the weight of scholarly consensus for over 200 years. On hand, there is nothing obviously wrong with it. But stand on Pennsylvania Avenue, not in a photograph, not on a map. Walk out onto the actual surface on a quiet morning, before the commuter traffic thickens, and stop in the center lane and look east toward the Capitol Dome, rising at the far end of the corridor. The roadbed alone is 120 feet across. The sidewalks add another 20 feet on each side. Walk from the south curb to the north curb. Count your steps. At a normal adult walking pace, you will take approximately 42 steps. In 1800, a person of average stride would have taken those same 42 steps, not across pavement, but across raw graded earth, through a cleared swath of Maryland marshland stretching between a partially built Capitol and a partially built President's House. Abigail Adams, on writing to her daughter from Washington in November of 1800, during the first weeks after the federal government had relocated from Philadelphia, described Pennsylvania Avenue as a muddy road through something she called a great forest, with felled timber stacked along its margins and woodcutters' paths running off into the trees. She described arriving at the President's House through mud that seized the carriage wheels. The avenue she crossed to reach it was 160 feet wide. Abigail Adams, the First Lady of the United States. Mud. 160 feet of graded earth cutting through woodland, connecting 2 unfinished buildings in a city that did not yet functionally exist. That is the street whose width L'Enfant explained as an anticipation of future civic grandeur. That is the street whose proportions have been accepted, for 2 centuries, as the gesture of an idealist with a long view. Now, lift yourself above the plan and look at all 14 avenues at once. L'Enfant named each one for a state in the original Union. Each runs diagonally across the rectilinear grid of standard streets at a precisely calculated angle. Each connects 2 points that L'Enfant called reservations. The circles and squares placed at the intersections of the diagonals distributed across the city's surface. Massachusetts Avenue, 160 feet wide. New York Avenue, 130 feet. Connecticut Avenue, 130 feet. Vermont Avenue, 130 feet. Maryland Avenue, 160 feet. Virginia Avenue, 130 feet. New Jersey Avenue, 130 feet. The original Ellicott copy of L'Enfant's plan, the surveyed redrawing produced in 1792, currently held in the Geography and Map Division of the Library of Congress, shows each diagonal avenue angled precisely to run between specific elevated points in the landscape. Capitol Hill is the highest ground in the eastern grid. The President's House occupies a slight rise above the Tiber Creek floodplain to the northwest. Meridian Hill, which L'Enfant specifically flagged in his notes to Washington as a significant reservation requiring a monument, commands an unobstructed view south and east across the full extent of the city. Georgetown Heights closes the western approach to the whole grid. L'Enfant did not connect neighborhoods. He connected high points. And at each point where 2 diagonals cross, at each of the 15 circles and squares placed precisely at those intersections, the roads open in every direction simultaneously. 14 avenues, 15 circles. 14 avenues, 15 circles, 160 feet, stretching from elevation to elevation through the low ground between. 160 feet, 160 feet. In 1991, the bicentennial year of L'Enfant's original plan, architectural historian Pamela Scott published an analysis of the plan's geometric structure in Washington history. The peer-reviewed Journal of the Historical Society of Washington, D.C. Scott, whose research on the Capitol's architectural and iconographic history has been published through the United States Capitol Historical Society, and examined the diagonal avenues not as decorative gestures, but as a coordinated structural system. She identified what she called command nodes, her phrase, her quotation marks, at the elevated positions where multiple avenues converge. From Capitol Hill, she documented unobstructed sight lines running down Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey avenues, covering every southern and eastern approach to the hill. From the President's House, she documented a corresponding radiating structure covering the northern and western approaches. From Meridian Hill, which L'Enfant specifically noted as a key position in his surviving correspondence, she documented a sightline structure commanding the entire central area of the city. Scott named this. She documented it with direct reference to the original survey drawings. She laid out the geometry with precision. Then she concluded that the structure expressed the iconography of Republican authority, the commanding gaze of democratic institutions surveying the landscape they were founded to govern. She moved on to other aspects of the mall's development. She saw the overlapping fields of vision. She named them command nodes. She described their radiating structure clearly and accurately. She interpreted all of it as symbolic. She did not ask what a command node is for. She did not ask what was designed to move through 160-foot avenues toward those elevated positions, or away from them, or through the circles placed at their intersections. Here is what the official explanation actually requires. The civic grandeur argument. building for future growth, projecting Republican ambition, designing for a population that would eventually arrive, is an aesthetic and demographic argument. It explains why the avenues are wide. It does not explain why they are precisely this wide, and not 10 feet wider or 30 feet narrower. Grandeur is not a formula. Anticipation of future growth is not a formula. Neither produces a specific number. Military engineering produces specific numbers. L'Enfant trained at the École Royale du Génie, the French Royal School of Military Engineering, before leaving France for America in 1777. His service records, held in the Archives Nationales in Paris, document him as an ingénieur militaire. He did not study landscape architecture or boulevard design. He studied fortification, the geometry of defensive works, the sighting of artillery batteries, and the controlled movement of infantry through contested terrain. When he arrived in America and was assigned to Washington's staff, he served as a military engineer. When he was commissioned to design the federal city in 1791, he was still, by training and by record, a military engineer. The French military doctrine under which he trained, codified in the Ordonnance of 1776, the foundational manual governing French infantry tactics and engineering throughout the period of L'Enfant's formation, specified precise road surface requirements for the movement of tactical units. A company of 60 men in standard marching column required 15 feet of road surface. A battalion of 600 in open order formation required between 120 and 140 feet. Or a regiment of approximately 800 men in full open order deployment, the formation used for urban movement, for the ceremonial and tactical entry into a city, and for the controlled movement of force through a prepared corridor, required between 140 and 160 feet of clear road surface, including flanking space for officers and the color guard. These figures are not estimates. They are in the manual. They were standard. Pennsylvania Avenue, 160 feet. Full regimental deployment. Massachusetts Avenue, 160 feet. Full regimental deployment. Maryland Avenue, 160 feet. Full regimental deployment. New York Avenue, 130 feet. Battalion open order. Connecticut Avenue, 130 feet. Battalion open order. At New Jersey Avenue, 130 feet. Battalion open order. The correspondence between L'Enfant's Avenue widths and the French military formation specifications from his training period is not approximate, not coincidentally similar. It is exact to within the 5-foot tolerance allowed by standard surveying practice of the era. The civic grandeur argument cannot explain why this correspondence exists. It cannot explain why a street designed to impress future generations of citizens and foreign diplomats matches, width for width, the formation specifications in the French military engineering manuals of 1776. I want to be precise about what I am saying and what I am not saying. I am not arguing that Washington, D.C. was secretly designed as a military installation. I am not arguing that George Washington concealed a militarized plan behind a civic and democratic presentation. I am not arguing that L'Enfant deceived the Congress, or that anyone involved in the founding of the Capitol intended to mislead posterity about the nature of the design. There are no memos. There is no meeting. There is no hidden document where someone decided to embed a martial geometry inside an avenue plan and then agree not to say so. This is not a conspiracy. Conspiracy requires coordinated, deliberate deception. What I am describing requires nothing so dramatic. It requires only the most ordinary thing in the history of knowledge. A man trained in one discipline who applied the logic of that discipline to a new problem. And 2 centuries of scholars trained in adjacent disciplines who evaluated his work without ever checking it against the vocabulary in which it was originally produced. Military engineers think in formation, widths and fields of fire, and the geometry of command. Architectural historians think in civic proportion, aesthetic iconography, and symbolic meaning. The numbers have been sitting in the Library of Congress for over 200 years. The scholars who wrote about L'Enfant were not members of the disciplinary community that would have known what to do with them. That is not concealment. That is the ordinary and entirely predictable operation of how knowledge fields divide the world, and it is far more common and far more consequential than any conspiracy would need to be. There is a precise name for this kind of failure. Thomas Kuhn, in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1962, described how the dominant explanatory framework within a field, what he called the paradigm, determines not only which answers are accepted, but which questions are generated in the first place. Questions that fall outside the paradigm are not rejected or suppressed. They simply do not arise, because the conceptual categories that would produce them are absent from the frame. The historian of science Ludwig Fleck, whose earlier work Kuhn drew upon, called this the thought collective, a community of scholars whose shared assumptions silently determine the shape of what they are capable of seeing. L'Enfant's plan has been evaluated within the thought collective of civic and architectural history for over 2 centuries. And the questions that belong to that collective, questions about proportion, iconography, democratic symbolism, aesthetic ambition, have been asked thoroughly and well. The questions that belong to the thought collective of military engineering history, questions about formation widths, fields of fire, the geometry of controlling urban terrain from elevated positions, have never been asked because the historians who wrote about L'Enfant were not members of that collective. The source documents are public. The Library of Congress holds the drawings. The Archives Nationales holds the training records. The French military manuals of 1776 are digitized and available. The measurement comparison that would either confirm or dismantle this reading has never appeared in a published study. The question was not hidden. It was never formed. And these are very different things. Pennsylvania Avenue is still 160 feet wide. It has been 160 feet wide since before any living person was born. It will be 160 feet wide after every person now living is gone. The measurement has survived every administration, every urban renewal project, every congressional debate about the capital's future across 2 centuries of continuous use. It is carved into the grade of the earth beneath the asphalt. It is, in that sense, the most permanent object in Washington, more durable than any building that lines it, more stable than any institution that has occupied the buildings at either end of its length. The inaugural parades that move down it fill the street without crowding it. The funeral processions for presidents travel its length with full military honors. Veterans' columns march it on national holidays, the formations held tight to the roadbed, with room remaining on both sides. It holds everything that passes through it with ease because it was built to hold formations larger than any modern ceremony places in it. We call it ceremonial. We call it symbolic. We say it expresses the ambition and the confidence of a new republic writing its values into the landscape. L'Enfant's grand vision, given permanent form. We photograph it. We name buildings after its address. We walk it on the most significant days in the national calendar and feel something rise in the chest at the breadth of it, the long, clean line of it, the sense of a country that believed in its own future. And we have not stopped to ask why a symbol designed to project civic grandeur happens to match, within 5 feet, the exact road surface required by the French military formation standards of the man who designed it. The avenue is still standing. It has been standing since before the city around it was real, since before the buildings that line it were constructed, since before the government that uses it existed in anything beyond aspiration and survey markers in the earth. It will be standing after everything that currently faces it has been rebuilt, renamed, and rebuilt again. The measurement is in the ground. The sight lines are in the ground, running from the elevated circle at Capitol Hill down the 160-foot corridor to the elevated position at the White House, open and unobstructed, exactly as L'Enfant drew them in the year when 3,000 people were supposed to grow, eventually, into all of this. No commission has proposed altering the widths. No administration has questioned the proportions. The Ellicott copy is in the Library of Congress. The Ordonance of 1776 is one search away. If every measurement was chosen for grandeur, for growth, for the grand and permanent scale of a republic announcing itself to history, then why does every measurement close,